Peter Harrison sat in his quiet, secluded study, the only sound the occasional rustle of a wind chime hanging by the open window. It was a perfect autumn evening, and the pale orange light of the setting sun filtered through the trees surrounding his property. His home, an old two-story house nestled on a stretch of land far enough from the hustle of city life but not so far as to be utterly isolated, was a place of sanctuary, a refuge from a world that often felt too fast, too chaotic, too out of control. But more than anything, it had been a place where Peter had hoped to find peace after the tragic death of his wife, Lydia. Lydia had been the love of his life, a woman whose memory he could never escape, not that he wanted to. Their home was filled with the traces of her books, her paintings, her soft laughter still echoing in the corners of rooms where she used to sit and read. But it was the garden that had always been the centerpiece of Lydia's legacy. They had designed it together years before her passing, planning each flower bed, each wind-in path with careful deliberation. It had been their project, their joint creation. It was more than just a garden to Peter. It was a living tribute to their shared life, a memory he could walk through each day. It was the last thing they had truly built together, and Peter had always intended to preserve it for as long as he could. The garden was overgrown now. What had once been a neat series of beds and paths had become a wild, untamed wilderness of color. Vines had crept up the stone walls, and the flowers, once carefully arranged in rows, now grew in messy tangles. To anyone else it might seem like a neglected space, but to Peter it was perfect. It was the garden Lydia had wanted, full of life and disorder. It was the way she had always loved it, never too rigid, never too controlled. In the years since her passing, Peter had let it grow, let it live and evolve in its own way, much like his own grief. It had become an expression of his love for her, a connection to the past he couldn't let go of. But that connection was under threat now. Peter had received the letter that morning, a letter that would change everything. It was from Linda Mason, the president of the local homeowners association, a group that Peter had always avoided, preferring to stay out of their way as much as possible. But Linda had made it clear that the association's rules were not optional, and Peter's garden had become a problem. According to the letter, it had to be leveled and brought in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. The phrasing had been polite enough, but there was no mistaking the demand buried in the carefully constructed words. If Peter didn't comply, he would face fines, and if the fines were ignored, legal action could be taken. Peter stared at the letter for a long time, disbelief creeping into his mind. He had been through the grief of losing Lydia, the painful process of trying to live without her, and the slow rebuilding of his life. But this, the idea that someone could come into his home and dictate what he could or couldn't do with the land that had once belonged to his wife, was something he hadn't prepared for. The thought of losing the garden was unbearable. He knew it wasn't just a matter of rules and regulations. It was his last connection to her. It was a living, breathing memory. And now, someone was telling him it had to go. Peter tried to push the anger down, but it bubbled up inside him like a storm threatening to break free. The letter had made it clear that there would be no exceptions, no accommodations for personal history or sentimental value. Linda Mason and the association were not interested in the meaning behind the garden. They were interested in conformity, uniformity, and the neat, orderly appearance of the neighborhood. And yet Peter had always believed that his land, his sanctuary, was exempt from the rigid standards that the homeowners association imposed on the other residents. He had always paid his dues, kept up with the maintenance of his property, and never caused any trouble. So why was his garden suddenly such a problem? He couldn't help but feel a sense of violation, as if something fundamental was being taken from him. The garden was a symbol of his life with Lydia, a place where he could reflect on the past, but also a place that allowed him to move forward in his grief. It was a sanctuary for his soul, a space where time seemed to slow down, where he could escape the relentless pressures of the outside world and simply exist in peace. To lose that would feel like losing her all over again, and Peter wasn't sure he was ready for that. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling garden that had become his refuge. The late afternoon light bathed the plants in a warm, golden glow, and for a moment, Peter almost forgot about the letter. He could almost hear Lydia's voice as if she were standing beside him, telling him not to let anything, anyone, take this from him. She had always been the stronger of the two, the one who knew how to fight for what mattered. But now, Peter was on his own. And for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of purpose ignite inside him. He couldn't let Linda Mason or anyone else take this from him. Peter's eyes narrowed as he stared at the garden. He had spent so much time building this place, and now someone wanted to tear it down without a second thought. The garden wasn't just a collection of flowers and plants. It was a manifestation of love, of memory, of a life shared. He wasn't going to let anyone erase that. He would fight for it, even if it meant going up against the Homeowners Association and the rules they imposed on everyone. He wasn't about to let the last piece of Lydia slip away without a fight. He walked over to his desk and grabbed the letter, crumpling it in his hand. His first instinct was to tear it up and forget about it, to throw it away and pretend it had never been delivered. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the solution. Peter was no stranger to fighting for what was right. He had done it many times in his career as an architect, working to bring his vision to life, no matter the obstacles. This would be no different. He would take action, and he would do so strategically. He knew the next step wasn't just about rejecting the demands of the Homeowners Association. It was about standing his ground, about asserting his right to live in his own home, on his own terms. He would need help, of course. He wasn't naive enough to think he could fight this battle alone. He would need to bring in legal experts, maybe even gather evidence to prove the garden's significance. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to back down. With a sigh, Peter opened his laptop and started researching the Homeowners Association's bylaws. He wasn't going to be caught off guard by their rules. He would read everything, learn what he was up against, and figure out how to fight back. If they wanted a battle, he would give them one they wouldn't forget. He wouldn't let them take his garden, his memories, or his peace of mind. Not without a fight. Not while he still had the strength to stand up for what was right. The following days passed in a haze of tension for Peter. After receiving the letter from Linda Mason, the president of the Homeowners Association, he tried to go about his routine, but every step seemed weighed down by the looming conflict. His mind kept drifting back to that letter, the one that felt like a personal affront to everything he held dear. The fact that someone could just show up and decide what was acceptable in his own yard, his sanctuary, was a concept so foreign to him that it nearly made him sick. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than just a disagreement over a garden. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It felt personal, as though Linda's demands were a direct challenge to his right to exist in his own space, a space that had once been shared with Lydia, a space that was sacred. The more Peter thought about it, the more convinced he became that he couldn't just ignore the situation. It wasn't in his nature to sit idly by while someone trampled on what he cared about. He had worked too hard to build his life and home alongside Lydia to let it all be swept away by the whims of an overzealous neighborhood association president. But the stakes were higher now. He wasn't dealing with a simple dispute over a flower bed or a fence. What Linda was asking for wasn't just to prune the garden or tidy up a few stray branches. She wanted him to completely alter the very thing that made his home feel like home. She wanted him to erase the part of it that was his connection to his wife, a memory that was irreplaceable. It felt like she was asking him to erase Lydia herself. He needed to act, and he needed to do so with the precision and care of someone who knew exactly how to handle a situation like this. Peter wasn't a stranger to dealing with difficult people, and he certainly wasn't unfamiliar with bureaucracy. As an architect, he had navigated more than his fair share of city ordinances, zoning laws, and government regulations. But this was different. It wasn't just a set of bylaws or building codes. This was his life, his wife's life, his memories. Peter knew that if he wanted to keep the garden, he would need to fight not just on a legal front, but on an emotional one as well. The thought of losing the garden felt like a betrayal to Lydia, and he wasn't sure how to navigate that loss without being consumed by it. The following morning, Peter woke up early. He had never been a morning person, but something about the quiet of the early hours seemed to suit him just then. The house was still, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustling of the trees outside. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, trying to think. He knew he had to respond to the letter. He couldn't just let it sit there like a time bomb. But he also knew that he couldn't rush into anything. He needed to be strategic, methodical, and most of all, informed. He needed to know what he was up against. Peter started by rereading the letter once more. He already knew the contents by heart, but there was something about seeing the words on paper again that made the situation feel more real, more urgent. The association had been clear in its demand that the garden be leveled, to conform to what they deemed acceptable for the neighborhood. There was no mention of Lydia, no understanding of the history behind the garden. It was just a matter of compliance, as if Peter's personal connection to the space didn't matter at all, as if it were simply a piece of property to be molded to fit a uniform, sterile ideal. The more Peter read, the more the sense of violation grew. It wasn't just about the garden. It was about control. Control over the lives and the properties of everyone in the neighborhood. It was about power, and Peter was beginning to realize just how much he had underestimated the force behind Linda Mason and the Homeowners Association. He needed help, that much was clear, but he didn't want to reach out to just anyone. He needed someone who understood the law, someone who could navigate the maze of regulations and bylaws that governed not only his property but also the power of the association. He knew of a local lawyer, Mark Robinson, who specialized in property law. Mark had represented a few neighbors in similar disputes in the past, and while Peter hadn't had much personal experience with him, he had heard nothing but good things. More importantly, Mark understood the system. Peter could already imagine the conversation he would have with him, how he would explain the situation, how he would lay out the facts and the stakes. But there was something else gnawing at Peter. He knew he wasn't just fighting for his garden anymore. This was going to be bigger than that. Peter had always been a quiet man. He had never been one for confrontation, and he certainly didn't seek out conflict. But he wasn't naive. He understood that Linda Mason wasn't going to back down just because he refused to comply with her demands. He also knew that the Homeowners Association wasn't going to simply forget about him or his garden. He had to be prepared for a prolonged fight, one that might involve more than just legal battles. There were politics at play, and Peter could feel them in the air, thick and suffocating. His home, his sanctuary, had become a battleground, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep standing before it all came crashing down. It wasn't just the legal challenges that were weighing on him, though. It was the sense of helplessness, the gnawing feeling that no matter how much he fought, he would always be outmatched by the powers that be. He was just one man against a network of people who had the money, the influence, and the will to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. Linda Mason wasn't just a president of a homeowners association. She was a force to be reckoned with. And if Peter had learned anything in his life, it was that people like her rarely lost. But Peter wasn't going to go down without a fight. He couldn't. He would use every resource at his disposal. His knowledge of architecture, his understanding of the law, his ability to think strategically, to ensure that his home remained his. He would fight not just for the garden, but for his life, for his right to live in the space he had built with Lydia, for the right to remember her in peace. His decision was made, and though a part of him still hoped for an easier way out, he knew deep down that there was no going back. The battle had already begun, and there would be no turning away from it now. The question was, what would it take to win? The first step, Peter realized, was reaching out to Mark Robinson. He needed to explain the situation clearly, succinctly. He needed someone who could look at the situation from a legal perspective, someone who could tell him exactly where he stood and what his options were. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes, especially not with the stakes as high as they were. Peter stood up from the table, feeling a newfound determination rising within him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he would get them. He would find a way to fight back. This garden, this piece of his life with Lydia, was worth fighting for. And no matter how difficult the road ahead seemed, he would not let Linda Mason or anyone else take that away from him. Not without a fight. The morning after Peter's decision to consult with a lawyer, he woke up earlier than usual, his thoughts racing. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden hue over the neighborhood, and yet Peter already found himself at his desk, papers scattered before him. He had gathered all the documents he could find regarding his property, including the original house plans, the garden layout, the homeowners association's, HOA, initial correspondence, and even the various emails he had exchanged over the years with Lydia regarding their shared vision for the garden. Every piece of paper on the desk now felt more like a battlefield, each one representing another step in the conflict he knew was only just beginning. Peter had lived in this house for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't just a home, it was a reflection of his life with Lydia, a place where they had built something together, something real. He could still remember the first day they moved in, the way Lydia had practically floated around the house, excited to make it their own. The walls, the floors, the rooms, every corner was filled with the warmth of their shared life. Over the years, they had filled the house with memories, and the garden had become the crown jewel of it all. It wasn't just a collection of flowers and plants. It was a work of love, a place where Lydia had poured her heart and soul. And now, in the wake of her passing, it had become his sanctuary, the one space he could still feel her presence. The thought of anyone, especially someone like Linda Mason, telling him it had to be destroyed, was simply too much to bear. The tension in Peter's chest had been building ever since the letter had arrived, and now, as he sat there in his study, he felt a simmering anger begin to bubble to the surface. Linda's letter wasn't just a demand. It was an attack, an unwarranted intrusion into his private world, one he wasn't prepared to let go without a fight. Peter had told himself that he would consult with a lawyer, take the legal route, but as the hours passed, the thought of doing nothing, of simply waiting for the association's next move, gnawed at him. He needed to act, and he needed to act now. Mark Robinson, the lawyer he had been thinking about calling, had been a friend of a friend, someone he knew by reputation as a man who didn't back down easily. Mark had built his practice on defending homeowners against corporations, landlords, and bureaucrats who thought they could push people around. Peter was counting on Mark to be the ally he needed in this fight, and that meant he had to be careful about how he approached the situation. A lawyer like Mark would need facts, documentation, and a clear picture of what was at stake. Peter had already started to gather the basics, but now he needed to think like a strategist. This wasn't just about fighting for a garden. This was about standing up to an oppressive force, a system that had, in his mind, become too powerful for its own good. After a quick breakfast, Peter took the first step and called Mark. He dialed the number he had found through his research and waited as the phone rang, the sound echoing in the quiet room. When Mark finally picked up, Peter introduced himself, his voice tense but steady. "Mr. Robinson, my name is Peter Harrison. I was hoping to discuss a situation I'm currently dealing with. It's regarding a homeowners association and some legal action they're threatening against me. I've been told you might be able to help." Mark listened attentively, and after a few moments he replied, "Of course, Mr. Harrison. Tell me what's going on, and we'll figure out how we can move forward." Peter explained the situation in detail, starting with the arrival of the letter from Linda Mason and her demands that he remove or level the garden. He described the history of the property, the emotional connection he had to it, and his growing concern that the HOA was targeting him for reasons beyond just aesthetics. Mark took notes as Peter spoke, his tone calm but analytical. "I understand," Mark said when Peter had finished. "The homeowners association can be a tricky beast to deal with, especially when they have such a narrow view of what acceptable is. But you're right to be concerned. There's more going on here than just a garden. It sounds like they're using their power to make you conform to their standards, and that's something we'll need to challenge." Peter felt a flicker of hope. Mark's words reassured him, and for the first time since the letter had arrived, he felt like he wasn't alone in this. There was a path forward, and it wasn't just about giving up or submitting to Linda's demands. Mark continued, "I'll need to see any documents you have, anything that's been sent to you from the HOA, any notices or fines they've issued, and especially the initial letter from Linda Mason. I'll also need to look at the original property plans, including the layout of the garden. We'll start building a case around the facts, and once we have everything in order, we can take the next steps." Peter agreed to meet with Mark the following afternoon, and after the call ended, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. He had done something, taken the first tangible action in what was sure to be a long and difficult battle. But as he sat there at his desk, the reality of what he had committed to began to sink in. This wasn't just a small issue of garden aesthetics. It was a question of his right to live in his own home, to make decisions about his property without interference from those who didn't understand or care about the personal history behind it. Peter wasn't just defending his garden. He was defending his life, his memories, his connection to Lydia. The next day, Peter met Mark at his office. The small, tidy space smelled of coffee and freshly printed paper, and Mark greeted him warmly, offering him a seat across from his desk. They went over the documents Peter had brought, carefully reviewing each one. Mark asked detailed questions, pushing Peter to clarify the timeline of events and to provide as much information as possible. Peter found himself becoming more and more frustrated as the conversation went on. It wasn't the lawyer's questions that bothered him, but the realization that, for the first time, he was truly facing the possibility that the homeowners association might win. The thought of losing his home, his memories, was almost too much to bear. "You've got a strong case, Peter," Mark said after a while, sensing his client's unease. "But we need to make sure we're prepared for the fight ahead. This is going to take time, and the HOA has the resources to drag things out if they want. We'll have to be diligent, patient, and relentless. The more information we have, the better our chances." Peter nodded, though a part of him still felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. This was bigger than he had anticipated, and as Mark continued outlining the potential hurdles they might face, Peter couldn't help but wonder if he had the strength to follow through. The garden had already become a symbol of his resistance, but the path to victory wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land, he was fighting for everything he held dear, for his right to remember his wife and to live in a way that honored their shared life. As they wrapped up the meeting, Mark gave Peter a clear plan of action. They would start by sending a formal letter to the homeowners association, asserting that the garden was not in violation of any local laws or zoning requirements. They would also begin gathering evidence to challenge the association's claim, making it clear that Peter was prepared to go to court if necessary. Mark explained that this wasn't something that could be resolved overnight, but that with enough preparation, they had a chance to win. Peter left Mark's office feeling both empowered and uncertain. The road ahead was long, and he knew it wouldn't be easy, but at least now he had a direction. He wasn't just fighting for a garden. He was fighting for his life, for his memories, for his right to live on his own terms. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was ready to take on whatever came next. As the days wore on, Peter found himself immersed in the labyrinthine world of legal documents, zoning laws, and homeowners association, HOA, regulations. It wasn't an environment he was used to navigating. As an architect, Peter had worked with blueprints and designs, but these legal forms, with their obscure language and complex terminology, felt foreign to him. Still, he pressed on. His lawyer, Mark Robinson, had been guiding him through the process, explaining the nuances of the case and the strategy they would employ, but it was clear to Peter that this was going to be a much longer and more grueling fight than he had initially anticipated. Every time he thought they had uncovered a new piece of information, it seemed to lead to even more questions. Peter spent countless hours at his kitchen table, poring over maps and documents, trying to piece together the history of his property and its connection to the HOA. He knew the rules had changed over the years. The HOA's bylaws, which had once been relatively lenient, had become more stringent, more rigid. He had seen it happen in other neighborhoods, how the once small associations had grown into powerful, almost omnipotent entities, wielding influence over every facet of residents' lives. At first, it had seemed like just another layer of bureaucracy, something he could easily ignore. But now, he saw how deeply entrenched and dangerous it had become. Mark had told him to dig into the history of the HOA and its dealings. "You need to know who you're up against, Peter. Get a feel for how they operate. Trust me, it will make a difference." So Peter did. He combed through old correspondence, meeting minutes, and newsletters from the HOA, trying to understand how they made their decisions, what motivated them. At first, it had been an exercise in frustration, but then, like a breakthrough in a design project, a pattern started to emerge. The HOA, as it turned out, wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood nice or orderly. There was money involved, big money. He began to see the connections, the handshakes, and backroom deals that had led to the formation of this organization's increasingly aggressive tactics. Peter found evidence of a land acquisition strategy that had been in motion for years. The HOA wasn't just concerned with maintaining property values, they were positioning themselves for larger-scale development projects. He started noticing familiar names cropping up over and over again in the meeting minutes. Real estate developers, contractors, and investors. These were the same people who had been behind some of the new developments in the area, the ones who had bought up old homes and converted them into high-end townhouses and condos. The HOA, Peter realized, was no longer just a body that enforced neighborhood rules. It had become a tool, a means for a few well-connected individuals to buy up properties and develop them for profit. And now, his garden, his sanctuary, stood in their way. But there was more. Peter discovered that Linda Mason, the HOA president, had been part of the original push to change the bylaws to make it harder for homeowners to contest the association's decisions. The more he dug, the clearer it became that Linda wasn't just some overzealous neighborhood busybody. She was part of something much bigger. Her position in the HOA, her connections with the developers, and the way she wielded power made it evident that she was playing a long game. She had been grooming the neighborhood for years, preparing it for the kind of transformation that would generate significant profit for those at the top. Peter's home, his garden, stood in direct opposition to that vision. The more Peter learned, the more his sense of injustice grew. It wasn't just about his garden anymore. It was about something much larger. It was about the fight for control over the land, the rights of homeowners to live freely and make decisions about their own properties. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. It was enforcing an agenda, one that valued profit over people, conformity over individuality. And Peter, in his mind, couldn't stand idly by and let that happen. He knew he had to keep pushing, keep fighting, no matter how hard it became. The turning point came when Peter was reviewing a set of old maps of the neighborhood. He was looking for anything that might indicate a flaw in the HOA's argument, something that would give him an edge in court. He had been comparing these maps with the current property boundaries when he found something strange. A small discrepancy, a slight shift in the property lines that had occurred when the neighborhood was first developed. It was a subtle difference, but it could be important. Peter immediately made a copy of the map and sent it to Mark, asking him to take a look. Mark's response was immediate. "You're right. This could be a game changer," Mark said over the phone the next day. "This shows that the property line was never officially updated when the neighborhood boundaries were redrawn." That means the HOA has no legal claim over the garden. It also means that they've been operating outside their authority for years. If we play this right, we can expose a major flaw in their entire argument. Peter felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the realization that they were still far from winning. Yes, they had found a potential weakness, but it was one thing to know you had an advantage, and another entirely to prove it in court. The HOA wasn't going to back down easily. Linda Mason, in particular, wasn't the type of person to give up without a fight. Peter had seen her in action at a neighborhood meeting months before, when she had ruthlessly shut down any dissent. He knew that if she was involved in this, she would pull out every stop to make sure her vision for the neighborhood went forward. As Peter sat in his study that evening, reviewing the maps and documents once again, the weight of the situation settled over him. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. This was about standing up to a system that had become more concerned with profit and control than with the people it was supposed to serve. Peter wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting for every homeowner in the neighborhood who had ever felt the pressure of an association that acted more like a corporation than a community. But even with this newfound hope, Peter knew that the battle was far from over. He wasn't naive. He understood that Linda and the HOA would find ways to counter whatever move he made. They had the resources, the power, and the backing of the developers. The fight would be long, and it would be difficult. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when Peter would feel completely overwhelmed by the forces aligned against him. But he had made a decision. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The next day, Peter and Mark went to work on the case, carefully compiling evidence, preparing their arguments, and setting the stage for what would surely be a drawn-out legal battle. The more they uncovered, the more Peter felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But he also felt a sense of resolve that he hadn't experienced before. This was a fight he couldn't walk away from. The garden, the home, the memories, all of it was worth fighting for, and if he had to face the entire HOA and their powerful allies, he would do it. As Peter looked out the window at the garden, the sunlight filtering through the trees, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land. He was standing up for something far greater. He was standing up for his right to live in a space that was his, a space that had been built with love and care. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him, not without a fight. The days stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last as Peter steeled himself for what was coming. The momentum of the case had shifted somewhat since the discovery of the zoning discrepancy, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. Mark Robinson had been working tirelessly to compile evidence and build the legal framework they needed to take their fight to court. Every new piece of information they uncovered seemed to tilt the scales further in their favor, yet Peter couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle had not yet begun. He had seen Linda Mason in action. He had seen how she wielded her authority with ruthless efficiency, and he knew that the HOA wouldn't let something like a small legal loophole stop them from pursuing their agenda. They would fight back, and they would fight dirty. Peter understood that the only way to win was to remain one step ahead of them at all times. Peter's phone rang just as he was finishing up a late breakfast. It was Mark, his voice steady and professional, but with a note of urgency that immediately grabbed Peter's attention. "Peter, we've got trouble," Mark said, his tone cutting through the morning fog. "The HOA is doubling down. Linda's been working behind the scenes to get support from the developers. They're putting pressure on the city council now, trying to get them to back their decision and force you to remove the garden. They've even pulled some strings with the local media to get the story out there. You've got a lot of people watching you right now." Peter's stomach churned at the mention of the media. It was one thing to be embroiled in a legal battle with a faceless bureaucracy, but it was another thing entirely to have his personal life splashed across the pages of local newspapers. The idea of his garden, the last piece of Lydia he had left, becoming fodder for public opinion made him feel sick to his core. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of his privacy, a public stripping of something that meant the world to him. But as much as he wanted to ignore the growing pressure, he knew that the fight was bigger than just him. It was about more than his personal stake in the property. It was about standing up to a system that had overstepped its boundaries, that had used its power to trample over the lives of ordinary people for the sake of profit and control. Mark's voice pulled Peter back to reality. "Peter, we need to act fast. I've arranged a meeting with a few people, local journalists who are sympathetic to your case. They're going to help us get the word out, but we need to be careful. If the HOA gets wind of this, they'll come down on us even harder." Peter knew what Mark was suggesting, and despite the fear gnawing at him, he agreed. Public support was one of the few weapons they had left. They had to expose the truth, not just to the HOA, but to the entire community. The garden wasn't just a personal matter, it was a symbol of something larger, something worth fighting for. "Okay," Peter said, his voice tight with resolve. "Let's do it." Later that week, Peter found himself sitting across from 3 local journalists in a small, dimly lit cafe. The journalists were young, eager, and, as Peter could see, deeply invested in the story they were about to tell. He had never been comfortable with the spotlight, but he understood the stakes. He had come to the meeting with a clear message. This wasn't just a legal issue. This was about people being pushed around by powerful institutions that had no regard for the lives they were affecting. The journalists listened intently as Peter spoke, his words becoming more impassioned with each passing minute. He explained the history of the garden, the memories it held, and the emotional toll the HOA's demands had taken on him. He didn't shy away from the truth, even though it made him vulnerable. He knew that if he wanted to win this battle, he had to expose everything: the personal, the legal, the political. As the journalists took notes, one of them, a young woman named Sarah, looked up from her notepad and met Peter's gaze. "This is powerful stuff, Peter," she said. "We've heard rumors about the HOA's involvement with developers, but nothing concrete. If what you're saying is true, this is bigger than just your garden. It's about a whole community being taken advantage of." Peter nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had hoped someone would understand the broader implications of the case, but hearing it from someone outside the immediate situation made it feel more real, more urgent. It wasn't just about his garden anymore. It was about everything that had been slowly eroded by the unchecked power of organizations like the HOA. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that if he could expose the corruption within the HOA, if he could show the public how deeply it had infiltrated the neighborhood, then maybe, just maybe, he could win. But it wasn't going to be easy, not by a long shot. The conversation continued for over an hour, with the journalists asking questions and Peter answering as honestly as he could. He wasn't sure if he was convincing them or not, but by the time they wrapped up the meeting, Sarah had promised to write an exposé on the HOA's practices. She said it would run in the local paper within a week. Peter wasn't sure what would come of it, but he hoped it would be enough to tip the scales in his favor. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and mounting anxiety. Mark worked with Peter to refine their legal strategy, ensuring that every piece of evidence they had gathered was in order. They were preparing for a fight, one that could go all the way to court. But as the days passed, the pressure continued to build. Linda Mason wasn't one to back down easily, and Peter knew she was already planning her next move. The final straw came when Peter returned home one evening to find that his front gate had been vandalized. The metal had been bent, twisted, and spray-painted with graffiti. At first, Peter wasn't sure if it was an act of petty vandalism or something more sinister. But when he took a closer look, he saw a message scrawled across the gate in bold red letters: "Move the garden, or else." Peter stood there, frozen, staring at the words, feeling a cold wave of fear wash over him. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. The HOA was no longer hiding behind bureaucracy and illegal paperwork. They were making it personal. They were sending a message. They would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about power, control, and intimidation. Peter immediately called Mark, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "This just got real," he said. "They've crossed a line. They're not just threatening me with fines anymore. They're sending a message." Mark was on the other end of the line in seconds. "Peter, this changes everything," he said, his voice low and serious. "We need to get the police involved. This isn't just a legal issue anymore. It's a safety issue. I'll have a team ready to go, but we need to document everything. This is a turning point. They're not going to let up, but we're not backing down either." Peter felt a surge of defiance rise within him. He had spent so long trying to keep things civil, trying to play by the rules. But it was clear now that the rules had changed. Linda Mason and the HOA had thrown down the gauntlet, and Peter wasn't about to let them get away with it. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about his right to live in peace, to protect his home, to honor his wife's memory. And if the HOA wanted a war, they had just started one. The following week, Peter's story began to hit the local papers. The exposé, written by Sarah and her team of journalists, laid bare the extent of the HOA's involvement with developers, the underhanded deals, and the systematic manipulation of the neighborhood's residents. The response was swift and overwhelming. People who had once been passive bystanders began to take notice. Neighbors who had remained silent now came forward, sharing their own stories of intimidation and unjust fines. What had started as a personal fight for Peter's garden had become a larger movement, a fight for the soul of the community. But Linda Mason was not one to back down. As the media storm raged, she dug in her heels, preparing to fight back with everything she had. Peter knew this battle was far from over, but now he had something he hadn't had before: public support. It was no longer just his word against the HOAs. Now it was the community's voice against the system that had held them down for so long. And Peter wasn't going to let that voice be silenced. Not now. Not ever. The tension in Peter's life had reached a breaking point. The months of fighting, the constant pressure from Linda Mason and the HOA, the late-night research, the legal battles, everything had culminated in this moment. It wasn't just about his garden anymore. It wasn't just about his right to keep a piece of his life, his memories, intact. It had become something more, something bigger. It had become a fight for justice, a fight against the tyranny of a few powerful individuals who believed they could bend the world to their will. For Peter, this had turned into something personal, something that transcended legal documents and bylaws. It was about standing up for his wife's memory, for his right to live in peace, for his right to make his own decisions without fear of being steamrolled by those with more power and more resources. As the weeks wore on, Peter felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him more and more. The media had picked up on his story, but that also meant that his every move was being watched. The HOA had responded with their own narrative, using their connections in the media to paint Peter as a troublemaker, as a man fighting against the very thing that kept the neighborhood together. The public perception of him was rapidly shifting, and Peter knew that he was at the mercy of public opinion as much as he was at the mercy of the legal system. But there was no turning back now. Peter had committed to this fight, and he wasn't going to back down. He had gathered more evidence, strengthened his legal position, and exposed the corruption at the heart of the HOA's practices. The media had covered the story extensively, and the pressure from the public had reached a boiling point. People were demanding answers, demanding accountability from the HOA and its members. Peter knew that the next step would be the most critical one yet. If he could expose Linda Mason's true intentions, if he could show the world the lengths to which she had gone to manipulate the system for her own gain, then maybe, just maybe, he could win this battle. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed Mark. He needed the support of the media, and most importantly, he needed the truth to come to light. It all came to a head during the town hall meeting called by the city council. The HOA had requested a special session to discuss the issue with Peter's property, to push for a resolution that would force him to comply with their demands. The meeting was scheduled to take place at the local community center, and Peter knew it would be a showdown. The council members, who had always sided with the HOA in the past, were going to be put on the spot. They could no longer pretend that this was just a small, personal dispute. The eyes of the entire neighborhood, and the city itself, were now upon them. Peter arrived early, dressed in a suit that he barely recognized himself in. He hadn't dressed like this in years. It felt like putting on armor for the battle ahead. He was nervous, but his nerves were tempered by something else, a fierce resolve, a deep understanding that he was doing the right thing, no matter the cost. He had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, reviewing the legal documents, preparing his arguments, and organizing his thoughts. But he knew it wasn't just about the paperwork anymore. It was about telling the truth, about exposing the corruption and greed that had festered behind closed doors. It was about standing up and saying, "Enough!" The room was already buzzing with anticipation when Peter entered. The council members were sitting at the front, flipping through their notes, clearly preparing for the meeting ahead. Linda Mason was there too, sitting in the front row, her gaze cold and calculating. She was all business, the picture of confidence, as if she had already won. Peter couldn't help but feel a deep sense of anger at the way she carried herself. She was so sure of herself, so certain that she could bully him into submission. But Peter wasn't intimidated anymore. He had fought this battle on his terms, and now he was going to finish it the same way. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, but Peter could feel the undercurrent of tension running through the room. The council members didn't waste any time, diving straight into the issue at hand. Linda Mason spoke first, her voice smooth and authoritative. She laid out her case, explaining that Peter's garden was in violation of the HOA's rules, that it was causing a decline in property values, and that something had to be done to restore order. She was careful with her words, framing the issue as a matter of community well-being. It was the same story she had been telling for months, the same narrative she had used to justify her actions. Peter could see through it all. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't concerned with property values. She wasn't concerned with the neighborhood. She was concerned with control, with profit. The developers, the businessmen who had been quietly funding the HOA's efforts, were all part of this. They wanted his land, his home, to be part of their new development. The garden, the house, everything Peter had fought for was just another obstacle in their way. When it was Peter's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, taking a deep breath before he began. He knew this was the moment that could change everything. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every homeowner who had ever been silenced by the HOA, for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of an institution that valued money over people. He spoke clearly, his voice unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," he began, "I stand here today not just as a homeowner, not just as a man fighting for his garden, but as someone who believes in fairness, in the right to live in peace without fear of being pushed around by those who think they can control our lives. This isn't just about a few plants in my garden. This is about a much larger issue. It's about the right of every person in this room to have a voice, to be heard, to make decisions about their own property without being dictated to by those who have no understanding of what it means to be part of a community." The HOA, under Linda Mason's leadership, has become nothing more than a tool for powerful developers to get what they want at the expense of people like me. People who have lived here for years, who have built their lives here, who have invested everything into making this a home. And now, because of greed, because of money, you're asking me to give up the last thing I have left of my wife, of my life. Well, I'm not going to do it. I won't give in. I won't let them take this from me." Peter paused, allowing his words to sink in. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him. Some of the council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others appeared unmoved, their faces set in hard lines. But Peter could see a few people in the crowd, neighbors, friends, nodding along with him, their faces filled with silent support. For the first time in a long time, Peter felt like he wasn't alone. Linda Mason stood up to respond, her expression tight with anger. "This is not a personal issue, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice barely contained. "This is about the greater good. This is about the future of this neighborhood. We've worked hard to make this community a place that is desirable for everyone. Your garden, as beautiful as it may be to you, is a hindrance to that vision. If you refuse to comply, then we have no choice but to escalate this matter." Peter didn't flinch. He had expected this. She wasn't going to give up easily, but neither was he. "That's exactly the point, Linda," Peter said, his voice strong. "Your vision for this neighborhood doesn't include people like me. It doesn't include people who've lived here for years, who've made this place their home. Your vision is one of profit, one that values money over people, one that values conformity over individuality. You want to turn this neighborhood into a development project, to make it look pretty on paper so that you and your partners can profit. But I'm here to tell you that I'm not going to be part of that." Not without a fight. The tension in the room was palpable as Linda and Peter locked eyes. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't just about a garden. It was about something much deeper, much more significant. This was a clash of ideals, a fight for the soul of the community. As the council members deliberated, Peter sat back down, his heart racing. He knew that this was the moment that would decide everything. Whether he won or lost, the fight had already begun, and nothing would ever be the same. But as he looked around the room, he realized that he wasn't fighting alone. He was fighting for something much larger than himself, and that, he thought, was the one thing Linda Mason and the HOA could never take away from him. The town hall meeting had ended, but the tension in the air lingered like an oppressive cloud. Peter walked out of the community center, his steps heavy but resolute. The battle he had fought, the truth he had finally spoken, had left him emotionally drained. But there was something else there too, something deeper than just the exhaustion. He felt, for the first time since this all began, that he had truly said everything he needed to say. He had laid bare his soul, told the council and everyone in that room exactly what he had been fighting for, and it was a feeling that was almost liberating. But as liberating as it felt to stand up to Linda Mason and the HOA, he knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. He wasn't foolish enough to think that just because he had exposed the truth, everything would magically fall into place. The forces at play were powerful, and Linda Mason was not the kind of person who gave up easily. Peter knew he had to brace for what came next. The days following the meeting were filled with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The media coverage, which had once seemed like a potential victory, now felt like a double-edged sword. The neighborhood was abuzz with gossip and opinions, and while many neighbors had rallied behind Peter, some remained skeptical. They didn't want to get caught in the crossfire of a larger battle that was unfolding between Peter and the HOA. For every person who showed their support, there were others who whispered about the disruption, the stress, the uncertainty that came with taking a stand. The HOA, meanwhile, was still working behind the scenes, its legal team preparing for the inevitable court battle. Despite everything, Peter found solace in one small corner of his life, his garden. Even as the world around him seemed to spin out of control, he could always return to the sanctuary that Lydia had loved so much. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a testament to everything he had fought for, the memories, the love, the resilience. It was a piece of their shared history, and no matter how many people tried to tear it down, it would remain. He had made a promise to Lydia that he would never let go of what mattered most, and now, more than ever, he understood what that promise meant. Then came the call. Peter had been expecting it, had known it was only a matter of time. It was Mark Robinson, his lawyer, and Peter could hear the tension in his voice before he even spoke. "Peter, I think it's time to prepare for the worst," Mark said, his words measured. "The HOA is moving forward with the lawsuit. They filed the paperwork, and it's official now. We have to be ready for this to go to court. It's going to be a long road, and I can't promise anything, but we'll do everything we can." Peter's heart sank. As much as he had hoped that the media coverage would bring the HOA to its senses, as much as he had hoped that Linda and the other members of the board would back down, the reality was sinking in. They weren't going to back down. They had a plan, and they had the resources to see it through. Peter was just one man, and the HOA had the power of a whole network behind them. The fight was real, and it was going to be brutal. The next few weeks were a blur. Peter and Mark worked tirelessly, preparing their case. They reviewed every piece of evidence they had gathered, every document, every piece of correspondence. They combed through zoning laws, property records, and past legal precedents. Mark was meticulous, leaving no stone unturned, but Peter couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that clung to him. Every time he looked at the garden, it felt like a ticking clock, and the thought of losing it, to lose everything he had left of Lydia, was almost too much to bear. But there was no time to dwell on that. The case was moving forward, and he had to stay focused. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. Peter stood in front of the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had led up to this moment, and Peter could feel the eyes of the entire neighborhood on him. It wasn't just his garden that was on the line anymore. It was something larger. This case had become a symbol for something bigger, a fight for fairness, for the right to live without fear of an overreaching, controlling system. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all the people who had been bullied, who had been made to feel small by the HOA. He was fighting for his right to live in a space that belonged to him, and him alone. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The lawyers representing the HOA were polished, professional, and ruthless. They were a well-oiled machine, and Peter could sense their confidence, their belief that they would win. They had the money, the power, the influence. They had been in control for so long that they had grown arrogant. But Peter wasn't afraid. He had Mark by his side, and more importantly, he had the truth on his side. The truth about what the HOA had become, the truth about the corruption, the manipulation, and the greed that lay at the heart of their actions. Peter wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. The trial was grueling. The lawyers for the HOA tried to twist the facts, tried to paint Peter as a troublemaker, a man who was standing in the way of progress, of order, of the greater good. But Peter's legal team, with Mark at the helm, was ready. They countered every argument, every accusation, with the truth. They presented evidence of the HOA's financial ties to developers, they exposed Linda Mason's connections to the real estate world, and they showed how the HOA had manipulated the rules to suit their own agenda. Slowly, bit by bit, they began to turn the tide. The more they revealed, the more the court and the public started to see the HOA for what it really was, a corporation that cared more about profits than people, more about control than community. But it was one particular moment in the trial that would prove to be the turning point. During cross-examination, Mark asked Linda Mason a simple question. Do you or the HOA have any financial interest in the development of the property surrounding Peter Harrison's home? Linda's confident facade faltered for just a moment, and that was all it took. Mark pressed on, and eventually, Linda was forced to admit that the HOA had been working closely with a group of developers who had plans to purchase Peter's property, plans that had been in motion long before the dispute over the garden had even started. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Linda tried to cover it up, to downplay it, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and it was clear to everyone that this fight wasn't about a garden. It was about something far more insidious, a plan to take control of the neighborhood, to displace longtime residents for the sake of profit. The judge took the time to deliberate, but the writing was on the wall. The evidence was irrefutable. The HOA had overstepped its bounds, using its power to manipulate and intimidate its residents for the benefit of a few. Peter's garden, his sanctuary, was more than just a symbol of his love for Lydia. It had become a symbol of resistance against a system that valued profit over people, conformity over individuality, and the court had recognized that. The verdict came down swiftly. The judge ruled in favor of Peter, ordering the HOA to cease all actions against him and his property. They were to pay for the damages caused by their legal threats, and any fines or fees associated with the garden dispute were to be dropped. But perhaps the most important aspect of the ruling was the judge's comment on the HOA's behavior. This case has revealed the dangers of unchecked power in organizations such as the HOA. It is a reminder that the rights of individuals must always be protected, no matter how powerful the opposition. Peter stood up, the weight of the ruling slowly sinking in. He wasn't just victorious in his fight to keep his garden. He had won something far more important, the right to live freely, the right to protect his memories, and the right to stand up against those who would use their power to crush others. As he walked out of the courtroom, he knew that this battle had changed him. He had fought for what mattered, and in doing so, he had reclaimed something more valuable than just land. He had reclaimed his dignity. As Peter walked back to his home, he looked at the garden that had started it all. It was more than just a collection of plants. It was a living testament to everything he had fought for, everything he had lost, and everything he had won. And in that moment, as the sun set behind the trees, Peter knew that he had done the right thing. He had stood up for what mattered most, and no one could ever take that away from him.